Well, how exciting for me. And a bit nerve-wracking. But, that's bright. Ladies and gentlemen, how lovely to see so many of you. Thank you so much for coming along. I think we've got about 300 people here, and there's probably at least another 200-300 who've tuned in online, which is fantastic. That's a good crowd, as they say. So welcome to London's prestigious Royal Geographical Society, where over hundreds of years, some of the most profound thinkers have shared their thoughts. Will tonight be one such occasion? As I say, thank you for making the effort to be here. As the name suggests, we're going to talk about beyond zoos. So tonight, we're not going to be arguing about the merits and demerits of zoos specifically, but we'll be discussing the challenges that face the natural world, whether the response from zoos is up to the mark, and what a world beyond zoos might look like if we're to meet those challenges and to try and mitigate or even overcome them. To help us in our effort, I'm privileged to be joined by a truly stellar panel of experts, people whose varied and profound life experiences will enrich our thinking and our discussion. Before we start, officially, I just want to thank, on behalf of Born Free, our sponsors this evening. We've been helped by the Harry Hotel, the Gore Hotel, CSM Live, but I would particularly like to single out our headline sponsor, Nucleus, and invite its co-founder, Craig Vallis, to the stage just to say a few words. Craig.
Thank you very much, Will. And I'd like to say thank you that as a representative of Nucleus Group, I'm very proud and very honoured to be able to stand up here and welcome you and help facilitate this discussion from a personal and from a work perspective. I'm very proud. I grew up in South Africa, going to the game reserve maybe 2-3 times a year, and it is very special. And I think personally, I'd never imagined standing up here in the Royal Geographic Society, speaking and welcoming Born Free. So on behalf of Nucleus Group, I'd like to say thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Craig. So, ladies and gentlemen, just to set out what the shape of this evening looks like, I'll shortly give a little background information about zoos, just to give us some context. Now, I've been working in this field for 40 years. I suspect some of you at least know what my general opinion might be. So I'm probably not going to present tons of positive information, but I'm going to present some information which is just factual and that adds the context to our evening. And then I'm going to introduce each panelist and invite them to give a short presentation about their work, their experience, about 5 or 6, Greta, or 6 minutes each. And after that, I'll begin our discussion by asking our panelists to offer their thoughts on a series of talking points, exploring the natural world as it is now, and the role and response of zoos, and where we might go in the future. And after that, there's going to be a short question and answer session, which is available to those of you attending in person. I'm sorry, people at home, it's not available to you, but we have a rich and diverse audience here, and I'll look forward to about 15 minutes of Q&A. And then what I'm going to try and do is bring the evening to its conclusion by drawing together some of the strands of our discussion. And please don't forget that at the end, you, the audience, here and online, will be invited to take part in a short survey so that we can learn from your experience of this evening and understand your thoughts and perspectives. So as I say, let me begin with, it'll take about 2 minutes, just some information which I hope will set the scene. So there are about 10,000 zoos around the world, and they hold millions and millions of animals in captivity. And in 2013, I'm sorry it's 10 years old, it was estimated that 23% of the species held in zoos were threatened. So, flip it round, that would mean 77% were not threatened. And zoos are visited by a lot of people. The estimate is about 700 million visits are made. Now, that's not visitors, because they're not all just one visit. It could be multiple visits. But 700 million visits are made to zoos each year. And we may get on to discussing what impact that has. In terms of looking at some of the financial numbers, in 2018, the American Zoo Association members, they spent about $233 million on field conservation. And you might say, that's quite a lot of money. And I would agree with you. However, that's about 5% of how much those same zoos spent on operations and construction in the same year, $4.9 billion. And if you recall that there are about 230 member institutions of the AZA, then it works out at about $1 million per institution a year on average. Between 2013 and 2020, US zoos announced plans for new enclosures and exhibit expansions totaling $2.642 billion. And I only put those figures out there because we're looking at the response to the kind of biodiversity crisis that we face. There is a group of zoos in the United Kingdom called the Consortium of Charitable Zoos. And in 2019, they spent 4.2% of their total annual income on in situ conservation projects, 4.2%. Just bearing in mind that means 95.8% didn't. Another snippet of information, licensed British zoos collectively have a footprint of about 12,000 acres. That's 50 square kilometres. For comparative purposes, the National Trust manages 2,500 square kilometres. The RSPB manages 1,600 square kilometres. The Wildlife Trust manage 1,000 square kilometres. Of the 11 zoos in the UK with elephants, 8 have car parks bigger than their elephant enclosures. And then, finally, just a nod to education. So there was a report published in 2023, so this year, by Edney et al., and it found that of the 3,890 zoo visitors that they observed at Chester Zoo, one of the premier zoos in the UK, only 10.4%, only 1 in 10, stopped at any of the selected 97 educational interpretation sites at Chester Zoo. And those that did stop, remember it's only 1 in 10, stopped in front of those exhibits for an average time of 7 seconds. So, as I say, it's probably a highly coloured set of information that I've given you, but nevertheless, it's data, and data which we may want to refer to in some way over the next hour and a half or so. So now, I'm going to introduce our panelists. And my first panelist, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Winnie Kiiru. Dr. Kiiru is a research scientist and wildlife biologist. She is a highly accomplished research scientist and wildlife biologist with over 25 years of experience in wildlife management, environmental policy, and global environmental advocacy. She's based in Nairobi, Kenya, and she has significantly contributed to conservation through her strategic leadership, organizational expertise, and dedication to sustainable development in East Africa. In recognition of her outstanding contributions to conservation, Dr. Winnie Kiiru received the prestigious Order of the Grand Warrior Award in 2022, one of Kenya's highest civilian honors. Additionally, in 2016, she was honoured with the Woman of Excellence Award by the Kenya Association of Women in Tourism, underscoring her significant impact on the conservation landscape. So, without further ado, may I invite Dr. Winnie Kiiru to come to the podium. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's kind of scary to see so many faces. Will said you were all going to be online. Okay, so yes, thank you for that very generous introduction. And I will just go straight into my slides. So I thought about introducing Mpala Research Center, which is the place I work, where I spend most of my time now. It is a not zoo. So I want to show you just a short clip of what you would see if you visited Mpala, and we welcome particularly researchers and student groups to come and immerse themselves in a living laboratory where they can study wildlife and ecology, and let's see a little bit of what it looks like.
It's been amazing. It's the best experience I've ever had. It's completely changed my perspective on what I want to do and where I want to be in life.
I've loved every second of it. It's beyond my expectations.
The Impala Research Centre, where we do our second-year residential field course, is quite unique. It's in the heart of East Africa. It's got the most amazing sunsets, sunrises. The savannah is beautiful, and perhaps the most amazing part of it are the animals. It's got giraffes, elephants, hippos, zebra, gazelles of all kinds. And from a zoological standpoint, it just provides an amazing launch pad for looking at animals from an experimental and research perspective.
Okay. You can actually see the full video on YouTube. I just wanted to give you a snippet of what that looks like. Actually, those were students from Plymouth. They were visiting Mpala, student group. And that's the kind of place that I spend my time. And you can see it is not zoo. It's in Laikipia County, those of you who know a little bit of Kenya's geography, slightly just north of the equator. It's a large space, 48,000 acres, and it's a hub for scientists that come in to conduct research and work in our very good laboratories, just looking at some of groundbreaking discoveries on different aspects of wildlife. We have genomics labs, isotopes labs, all sorts of different bits of work happen at Mpala. And we look at endangered species, savanna ecology, animal behavior, and I am the executive director of this amazing place where so much wonderful research happens. Those are Grevy zebra. They're some of the most beautiful animals, really endangered. We've got just over 2,500 individuals left in northern Kenya. As Will said, one of my happiest moments as a researcher, nobody really ever knows what you're doing. And it's really nice when government kind of goes, yeah, we'll give you an award. And the reason I went back to the community, the Maasai community, to receive this award is because a lot of my work, much as it has centered around wildlife, I really recognize the role that communities like the Maasai play in just living with wildlife and making it possible for those of us who enjoy and study wildlife to actually be able to see animals in the wild. Often when you look at movies and things, you get to see Africa without people. And that is a narrative that's incorrect. Africa has people. And it is because of them that the wildlife survives. And if we are going to have wildlife in the future, It's because we recognize the people of Africa and the contribution that they make, waking up every morning and sharing their space and their resources with the wildlife. That was another beautiful moment. We had just come out of the historic ivory and rhino horn inventory and big destruction event. If you Google ivory bands, at any time you will find these beautiful images of us destroying ivory in Kenya and telling the whole world that, you know what, ivory belongs to elephants. And in that image, I went back to Amboseli again to just remind myself that after that horrible time, the smell of death everywhere, dealing with ivory tusks, sometimes even destroying tusks of elephants that I knew came from Amboseli, because we marked all the tusks and where they came from. Some of them were retrieved or taken back, confiscated from poachers. And knowing that I was burning tusks that had been poached from my friends, the animals that I had spent a lot of time studying, it's always nice to go back and see the ones that survived. And in that image, the elephants with those magnificent tusks is Craig, and the earrings I am wearing were actually modeled. Craig is, I'm wearing Craig right now. Yes. Craig is still alive, fantastically, and tourism continues to be a big income earner for my country. And I always say to people, visit Kenya, visit East Africa. Tourism is good for us. And I think you know who that is. Sometimes I have my other wonderful moments because, as Will said, I've spent my time not just working in the field, I've also done a lot of advocacy work, and it's actually quite recent. And I was at St. James's Palace, I need to say this correctly, officiating a roundtable discussion about wildlife conservation and the future of conservation in Africa. And His Royal Highness has always been a great supporter of wildlife conservation in Kenya. As the head of government relations for the Elephant Protection Initiative and supporting Task Trust, I was invited to do this. It was a wonderful moment. Sometimes it's not all bad. You do get to sit in nice places. And then a lot of my work, my research work has been in Amboseli, and I thought I would not leave you without a beautiful image of the last pair of twins that were born in Amboseli. Elephant twins are very rare. It's actually very rare occurrences when we actually get to see the twins. So this particular female was a very clever one, Angelina. She not only gave birth to twins, she was able to look after them, and the twins are still alive. We got 2 pairs of twins during that year, and unfortunately we lost one. The other mother wasn't as clever, but this Angelina managed to keep her twins alive. So with that, I just want to leave you with a bit of, yes, I've done a lot of work on elephants in the wild. I've also done a lot of advocacy work for elephants. I've done a lot of work saying to people, elephants don't belong in zoos, and ivory belongs to elephants and all that. So that's a little bit about myself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Winnie. That's inspirational stuff, and will power our conversation going forward. The next person that I want to introduce is Damian Aspinall, and I'm going to introduce him, and then I'm going to show a very short film before Damian comes up. Damian is the chairman of the Aspinall Foundation and the Howlett's Wild Animal Trust. He owns 2 zoos in Kent, Port Lympne Safari Park and Howlett's Wild Animal Park in Kent. However, Damian is well known for his outspoken views on the failure of zoos and his wish that they ultimately be closed, including his own facilities. The Aspinall Foundation breeds gorillas and other wild animals in captivity and works to return them to the wild in Africa. Damian describes the Aspinall Foundation as the preeminent rescue and rewilding organization in the world today. Well over 1,000 animals have been rescued or rewilded, including 70 gorillas and 300 primates. And the foundation has projects in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Gabon, Congo, Kenya, Madagascar, Java, Sumatra, and Pakistan. The Trust is a charity that runs these 2 wildlife sanctuaries in Kent and is world-renowned for its world record breeding of endangered animals and its rewilding programs. And if you want to read more about Damian's views, there's a document called Zoology Check. I've got a copy. But there are also about 45 copies available for you to pick up afterwards if you'd like to read more. So let me go to the film, and then I'll invite Damian to come to the stage, and I hope I do this right.
Thank you. It's a funny thing. I shouldn't be standing here, if you think about it. I've worked all my life protecting 2 wildlife parks. I've worked all my life trying to breed these animals in these wildlife parks. And all my life thinking what we've been doing is fantastic conservation work. And during this journey from the start to where I'm standing today, it's a journey of disillusion and disappointment. And I only found these things out by asking the questions. And often you have to ask questions that you don't really want to hear the answer. And often we all suffer from cognitive dissonance where we don't want to hear the truth because it's too uncomfortable for us to hear it. So it's been an extraordinary journey for me to go down this road where for years, the number 1 breeder of gorillas in the world, 150 gorillas, number 1 breed of black rhino, number 1 breed of clouded leopards, number 1 breed of Javan gibbons, Javan langurs. The list goes on. And you think you're doing this wonderful work for conservation. And slowly, over a period of time, it dawned on me that actually what we were doing was actually letting the animals in our care down. And we were actually letting you down because we were leading the public to believe, like all zoos do, that we're doing great conservation work. And that's a myth. It's just not true. And so I looked into this as deeply as I could and as honestly as I could, because cognitive dissonance is very, very hard to admit your life's work is wrong. And my father's life work was wrong. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized, God, this is terrible what we've actually done. It's terrible what we've done to you, the public, who believe that many zoos are doing great conservation, they're creating these great arcs, they're going to be rewilding. But when you look into it, you realize that 95% of the animals are not critically endangered. So why are they there? Why are they there for human consumption? You realize of the 800 mammal species in zoos, only 45 of those are critically endangered. And then when you dig deep into the data and you start looking at how many of those 45 are hybridized, how many of those 45 are diseased, how many of those 45 are genetically bottlenecked, only 4. So of the 800 mammal species, 45 are critically endangered, and only 4 of those species are viable. And that doesn't even mean they're viable and they should belong in zoos in terrible captivity all around the world, but they're viable. In other words, collectively, the zoological world has mismanaged the animals under their care. They've done a disservice to you, and they've done a disservice to the animals. So when that hits you, you realize, what can we do about this? We can't be quiet. We have to speak up. We have to tell people the truth. And we have to start to rewild. So I went on a journey in believing that the most important thing we can do now is to try and rewild some of these animals. And it's easy to think, well, that's very easy. You could just start rewilding. It's actually the hardest thing we do because, first of all, we rewilded the first zoo cheetah. Every single zoological establishment tries to stop you. They even lobby the governments you're trying to send the animals to, please don't let these cheetah arrive in your country. And when they do, they're domesticated, they won't hunt, they won't survive. And I go, but none of you know this, because none of you have ever rewilded a cheetah. And don't we think that they deserve the chance to live free and hunt? And who are you to try and stop that? So we just did it anyway. And we rewilded 15 cheetah, and they all hunted within the first 24 hours. And they've now bred with wild females, and they've got offspring. We've actually got a grandfather. So we have a cheetah born in England, living free in Africa, and he has grandchildren. So, and you think now when we've rewilded over 1,200 animals, 70 gorillas, 300 primates, all sorts of animals, that zoos would be wanting to follow our path. But they don't. I'm enemy number 1. And all I say to them is, well, speak the truth. Why don't you tell the public how many of your animals are hybridized? How many of your animals are diseased? How many animals do you rewild? And that to me is a tragedy. So for me, what I want to try and do is persuade public opinion that this has got to change. Because the politicians will never do that. Because there's no votes in closing zoos. So you have to create public opinion. And if we can get a swell of public opinion, you will change the narrative of the politicians. But that also creates all sorts of problems, because what happens to zoos, what happens beyond zoos, it's very complicated, it's very complex, it's not black and white. But I'm telling you now, from the inside, that everything that zoos are doing is a myth. There is no conservation value. They don't tell you the diseases, they don't tell you the hybridization, I can tell you unofficially that zoos now want to cull their animals. So rather than breed them, they want to cull them. We rescued 2 orangutans from Zurich Zoo, healthy male orangutans, 11 years old, they were going to be culled. We said, well, don't do that. We'll come and rescue them, and we're going to try and rewild them. That's the policy today. So I think evenings like tonight are really important because I hope that some of you, maybe all of you, or some of you will go away and think, we have to do something, we have to speak up. Because if we do nothing, then millions of animals all over the world are going to suffer unnecessarily, and they do suffer. Zoos will tell you they're happy, it's a lie. I just spent 3 years investigating zoos all over Europe, and I can tell you it's appalling, it's just a shame. And the zoos hide and they cover it up, and they tell you all this myths, but it's not true. So I'm here to debate this, I'm here to look beyond zoos. I'm a great fan of Will and what he does. And I'm sad to say that all our work in our wildlife parks is probably a waste of time, but we can change that and we can make a difference.
Well, if that hasn't got you thinking, I don't know what will. And now it's a huge pleasure of mine to invite Greta Yori to come to the microphone. Let me just tell you a little bit about Greta. She's the Director of Program Development for the Elephant Protection Initiative Foundation. Greta is an Ethiopian Italian. She is an environment and conservation advisor to various African governments and international organizations. She has extensive experience in working to bring an end to the illegal wildlife trade across the Horn of Africa, resolving human-wildlife conflict, and better understanding the gender dynamics of organized criminal networks, while encouraging more sustainable and inclusive conservation models across Africa. Greta is a Women for the Environment Africa Founding Fellow and currently heads the Elephant Protection Initiative Foundation's development program and human-elephant conflict and coexistence work across 23 African member states and between Africa and Asia. She passionately advocates for more compassionate and nuanced system change, including the vital collaboration required of all of us to enable socio-environmental justice and coexistence. So, ladies and gentlemen, Greta Yori.
Thank you so much, Will. It's an incredible honor to be here to discuss amongst friends and colleagues such a complex and often divisive yet vital conversation. So, as I've got 5-6 minutes to introduce myself, I thought I'd share some key images to paint a visual story and a glimpse into the many layers that have brought this little girl to this stage and this point in her career. My name is Greta Francesca Yori, and I was raised in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in the Horn of Africa. I'm the daughter of an Ethiopian mother who was born and raised by a noble family in Wenji, East Shoa, Oromia, from a long lineage of strong women ancestors. And an Italian Sardinian father who was born in Asmara, Eritrea, from parents who fled Italy as young adults between the world wars in the 1930s to better their lives. Off the bat, I'm a walking paradox. As some of you might know, Italy attempted to colonize Ethiopia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And therefore, to have been born of love of these two fascinating, culturally and historically rich but very different nations has allowed me to sit comfortably in the gray area of complexity, nuances, and duality. This has largely shaped my worldview and how I approach my passion for the natural world and social environmental justice as well as coexistence. As a young girl, and largely thanks to my parents' values, we were very privileged to be able to travel every corner of my country, and spending so much time in the outdoors meant that I also was able to notice how quickly things were changing. Like many children, I held a fascination for animals, particularly those of historical significance. The Lion of Judah was a key figure associated with Emperor Haile Selassie, who ruled Ethiopia between 1930 and 1974, and was known to keep lions, cheetah, and all sorts of exotic pets in his imperial palace. I was deeply impacted when visiting the only, at the time, terribly run lion zoo at the Siddis Kilo, which will know well, as well as the late emperor's imperial captive establishments in the capital. I often asked tough questions to anyone that would listen about shutting them down or re-releasing the lions. That was the start of my curiosity with wildlife conservation. Today, if you scroll through any of my social media, you'll rarely see the species I work so hard to protect showcased. People often ask me, but where are the posts about the wildlife, about the seizures, about the arrests, and who we can blame? Well, for me, wildlife conservation has always been about dealing with people, about governance, about our ethics, philosophies, and traditions, and unfortunately also about undoing the many historic injustices perpetuating these challenges today. My formal conservation work began in the Simien Mountains National Park, a renowned UNESCO World Heritage Site and in my country often referred to as the playground of the gods. It is home to some of the most endemic species of biological importance, but the iconic three are the Waila ibex, the Ethiopian wolf, and the gelada baboon. From the onset, I wanted to better understand the conflicting objectives of government, local, often incredibly impoverished communities, and tourism investors. At the time, ecotourism and wildlife economies were being hailed as the bulletproof solution to how we were going to save our wildlife and biodiversity. Following on from a couple of years in the mountains, I delved into the complex territory of curbing the exotic pet trade in cheetah cubs across Ethiopia into Somalia and the broader Horn of Africa, and then analyzed the devastating impacts of militarization of anti-poaching units in southern Africa, particularly how they were recreating apartheid-era segregations in communities. These experiences significantly opened my eyes, pushing me to challenge everything I was taught about species-specific conservation issues, and uncovering the interplay of power, history, politics, economics, gender, and land injustice, as well as the many impacts of global trade dynamics on the environment and wildlife. Michael Crichton says, "A crisis is a sum of intuition and blind spots, a blend of facts noted and facts ignored." I couldn't agree more. Ethiopia is currently en route to becoming a nation of 150 million people by 2030. Today, just under 70% of which are considered severely poor. This map accurately shows you the pressures we are facing in our landscape. The green blocks represent protected areas, reserves, areas of high biodiversity, forests, and the red represents households, large developments in agriculture, industrial expansion, road networks, you name it. Essentially, the conversion of land for the global marketplace. The shifts you see in the lands of faraway countries like my own rarely solely serve the country itself, but a global system and the boundless needs of consumer capitalist structures, particularly of Western economies and elite societies everywhere. Tackling the complex socioeconomic, political, and environmental dynamics, essentially of how the world is architectured and interconnected, has been my compass and driver the past decade. Recognizing that as we navigate the sixth mass extinction and uncharted territory with climate breakdown, all of this is only going to intensify unless we start facing the deeply uncomfortable root causes of the issues. Refusing to oversimplify complex, context-appropriate and critical matters regarding nature and people largely guides my philosophy today, and rather than dealing with symptoms in silos, I really believe that we can cooperate to dismantle a much deeper problem unitedly with integrity, flexibility, and transparency. Despite the enormous challenges ahead that I think everyone in this room is aware of, I very much believe we can co-create a world embedded in reciprocity, the long-term safeguarding of our sacred natural world at scale, and coexistence for all living things. Thank you for listening, and it's an honor to be here.
Thank you so much, Greta. And you're now beginning, I hope, to appreciate just what an incredibly talented panel of speakers we have this evening. And now, finally, I want to welcome Chris Packham to share some words with us, his perspective. Chris, as I'm sure you all know, is broadcaster, environmental and animal welfare campaigner based here in the UK. He's president of the RSPCA and works with numerous charities and activist groups to try and instigate rapid and effective transitions to a better world, nature and human solutions. He has a long history of working with captive animals and supports far-reaching reforms in the way we operate our captive wildlife collections. He says zoos are a fixture of our lives. They've kind of always been there, and thus they sadly have become, for many, background noise, too familiar to question something that just is, just happens. But the world has changed more rapidly than the vast majority of zoos, and the core ethos of many is outdated, and few are fueled with a genuine desire to accept the changes they so desperately need to make. He says, I grew up in zoos. My partner Charlotte inherited a zoo, but that was then. Now more than ever, we and they must robustly question their roles and radically change their practices. The floor is yours, Chris.
I was born on the 4th of May 1961 in a 3-up, 3-down in the suburb of Southampton. I crawled around a garden about the size of this stage, and by the time I could stand, I was fascinated by snails, tadpoles, woodlice, and any other small invertebrates that I could find. My parents thought that I went to school for the fundamentals of my education, but that I came home to be properly educated. So although they had little money, they spent most of it on books. And because of my almost inherited fascination with life, they bought me wildlife books. And many of those wildlife books were full of what we now call exotic animals. And there were exotic animals not too far from my home. So, from about 1963 to 65, every day during the 6 weeks summer holiday from the state schools that I went to, I would say to my mum over breakfast, please, 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 can I go to the zoo, Mum? And we'd get on the number 6 bus and we would go to Portswood and we would walk to a small holding facility run by the notorious Chipperfield family, where there were jaguar, elephant, giraffe, king penguins, a whole menagerie of animals, and it was a menagerie. The cages, and they were cages, were small and cramped, overcrowded and dirty. But I've got to tell you, I didn't see any of that. I smelled sea lions. I got pecked by the king penguins. And on one occasion, my mother lifted me up, and a giraffe craned its head down over the top of the chain-link fencing, which was broken, and it wrapped its great lilac tongue around my face. And something changed. My mum said, go and wash your face. And I went into the toilets and I ran the tap so that she could hear the tap running, but I didn't wash my face. At that point in my life, I craved that contact with exotic animals. And I spent most of my time running around in the fields that surrounded my house, catching animals and putting them in enclosures. And that was jam jars, and then that gravitated to tanks, and then that gravitated to enclosures in the garden, which was no longer a garden, it was a series of enclosures. By 1970, however, I was given a pair of binoculars, and I recognized almost instantaneously that I could learn more about the things that I loved most, watching them in their natural environment, rather than housing them in mine. And pretty much straight away, the tanks went, the jam jars thankfully had long gone, and my interest in captive animals began to dissipate quite rapidly. I was a young scientist. I'd been tutored well in my comprehensive to gather data and to better understand species, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to spend the rest of my life in an ivory tower studying birds, if I'm honest with you. It didn't work out that way, and I got into working in television. And a lot of the animals which we initially worked with came from captive collections, so I got to know the people who kept them. I got to know them to the extent that one of them asked me to be a trustee of that particular institution. And I took on that role. I was flattered by that. And so I found myself again working within the zoo world. And very often when I was making television, I was within the zoo world, working with captive animals. Indeed, up until fairly recently, I was working with captive animals in those situations because I was making programs about scientists who had studied them in those institutions. So, in order to talk about, as it was in that case, the cognitive abilities of those animals, I found myself once again confronted by some quite serious dilemmas which were developed by that stage. I found myself at one point, not many years ago, working with captive cetaceans because I was looking at the work that the scientists had done with these captive cetaceans. And this was part of an ongoing process whereby my perception of the way that these animals were being kept, the reasons they were being kept, frankly, the lies that we were being told about what they were doing there and what value they might have, had very much come to the surface. And when we were making that series, there was no end of conflict because I didn't want to any longer be in those environments supporting what they were doing. Long before that, I'd come face to face with the Chipperfield family and witnessed firsthand some of the grotesque cruelty that they had inflicted on their animals. And that again had brought me into conflict with the people making the television programs that I was employed to make. But I stood my ground, and I remember saying on one afternoon, if that woman doesn't go, then I'll go now. Because despite the fact that I'd grown up in that environment where a proximity to these animals was playing a formative role in my understanding of them at a very simplistic level, but affinity for them in a very significant level, I was never one that was going to tolerate that cruelty. But hey, this was the 1960s, this was the 70s and 80s. Since 1970, we've lost 59% of the world's wildlife. Since 1970, we've lost 90 million birds from the UK countryside. 5% of the world's mammals are now wild mammals. 95% are either human or those animals which we call farm animals. On my watch, as someone who has loved animals, on my watch, as someone who has done everything they could to conserve those animals, we've suffered colossal losses. So if conservationists summon the temerity to stand up and say that they're doing a good job, they are not. And the zoo fraternity has been part of that conservation cohort that has claimed to have been doing a good job. One of the reasons that motivates me to come to these sorts of events, one of the reasons that motivates me to get up earlier every day and work harder and harder is guilt. Because I've known that things weren't working. We have all known that things weren't working. We have presided over those catastrophic declines. Now we have to do something about it. I think we've reached a stage where it's our last stand for life on Earth. And I, for one, am not going to go down without a fight. I'm going to fight for those woodlice, those tadpoles, those poor animals that were incarcerated in that sickeningly horrible series of concrete pens in Southampton, and everything else that I've seen that's wrong. And the key thing is that despite the fact that we've measured all of those declines, and we know where we stand when it comes to biodiversity loss, we are equally equipped with a remarkable portfolio of technologies, energies, and abilities and practices, like those that Damian has already been talking about. We have the answers. The situation is not hopeless. But let me tell you one thing. The world will be destroyed by a lot of good people doing nothing. It's time for us all to do something.
Okay. Calm and quiet we are, but determined as well. So there you have it, 4 very, very different perspectives, huge experience, profound understanding of nature and the natural world, and a combined passion to do what needs to be done, or to at least try and do what needs to be done to protect it. My role now is to ask some leading questions to try and tease out some answers for you. And of course, you'll have your opportunity as well to ask a few questions as well. And I had got, I'm just going to warn the panel now, I had got my talking points written down, but what you've said sort of modifies the way that I want to conduct this conversation. I don't want to stick to the script too much, because we've already learned so much. So I guess my first point would be, and I just do want to mention, Chris mentioned Southampton Zoo and the family that ran it. The very first activist event that I went on in 1985 was with Richard Adams, the author, and my mum, and we marched on Southampton Zoo. I don't know if it was around the same time, but anyway. So my question is this. If we assume that modern zoos here, in the UK at least, have been around for a couple of hundred years. London Zoo, the 1820s was when London Zoo happened, and some will argue that Vienna was perhaps the first, quote, modern zoo. But if they've been around for a couple of hundred years, and if we treat that as an experiment, we say, okay, we've run this experiment for 200 years, how would you grade that experiment? And if you think it hasn't succeeded, what is your recipe? What is your suggestion for the direction that we take? I mean, Damian's already kind of touched on this in your presentation, because you've sort of come to the conclusion that it's over. But I'd like to hear, do we think there's any valid offering that zoos can give us in response to the kind of crisis that you've all identified? I don't know who would like to start with a thought on that. Is the experiment done, dusted, and over?
I'm happy to.
Yeah, Damian, start us off.
Well, actually, prior to London Zoo, the Tower of London was actually the first place they kept wild animals, and they had all sorts of wild animals, lions and tigers and many, many animals. And when it became too difficult to keep them there, they moved them to Regent's Park and London Zoo. I would love to say that something that we've all been doing is worthwhile. I'd love to be able to look at you all and say, well, actually, we've messed up a bit, but this is pretty good. But honestly, that's just not true. When you look at the problems that have been created, that I mentioned, the hybridization, disease, genetically inbreeding, genetically bottlenecks, which means there's not enough variety in the gene pool to keep the species going. You think we've just created a mess. And if zoos were really putting money back into conservation in the wild, and that's only half the issue, because you have to put it back effectively. No point just putting it back and ticking the box. You have to put it back effectively. I wouldn't argue, but some people would argue, well, yeah. But if you take the average of the most successful zoos in Europe, and you divide the amount of money they put into situ and divide it amongst the zoos, they give about 30,000 euros a year. So what we're saying is millions of animals enslaved in terrible conditions for you, the public, to go and see. And in return, those zoos, on average, will give 30,000 euro a year in situ. And that's only half the issue, as I said, because what are they doing with that money? One of my big issues is billions of pounds is put into conservation, and look at the mess we're in. Look at the mess the planet is in. So it's not enough to just throw money at things. This is what we tend to do. We throw money at things. But it doesn't solve the problem. You have to solve the problem before you throw the money at it. So we've all got it the wrong way round, but it solves a lot of people's issues. So I would love to sit here and say, look, there is a claim for zoos doing good work, but there isn't. In my humble view, not one single animal anywhere in the world should be encaged at all. And if that animal is critically... if that animal is critically endangered, okay, is the answer to take it to a zoo in Europe, in England, in London, in Stuttgart, in Zurich? Don't we surely we have to protect that animal in situ? You know, we protect gorillas on river islands, in the Gabon and the Congo. You know, we protect all sorts of animals in situ. You don't have to take an animal out of the wild and stick it to some god-awful zoo. That is not the way to do it. And then you need to ask yourself the question, what's the process that these animals are in the zoos in the first place? There must be a process, right? You know, if you're going to take gorillas out of the wild or lions, there must be a process. Who's thought, what panel, what government institution has decided this animal is so rare we needs to go to a zoo? There is no process. Not one single animal in one single zoo anywhere in the world has there been a process where a group of people get together and say, we can't put these animals in situ, it's too dangerous, there's a civil war, we need to take them out and we need to put them in zoological institutions. It doesn't exist. So I'm afraid to say, and this is, you know, my life's work, that there is no reason at all to have any animal ever in captivity, at all. And I wish I could be more positive, I wish I could say there was a case for conservation, but there isn't. And as uncomfortable that is to admit, it's the only way we're going to progress, and it's the only way we're going to actually change public opinion. And the amazing thing to me is, the people I call the zerocrats, right? They cannot change the way they think. To them, I'm enemy number one. And I'm just saying, guys, we've got to have a debate. We've got to talk about this. We've, for years, made a mistake. Let's try and correct it. What do we do? But sadly, I'm afraid that they don't want to have the conversation. They don't want to rewild. They actively try and stop me rewilding. They'd rather cull the animals than rewild. They would rather cull gorillas than rewild. It's an amazing thing. So I'm afraid I can't say anything positive or any reason why there should ever be any animal ever in captivity.
I'm going to keep that question going. Thank you, Damian, for that. I'm going to keep that question going, but I might add something to it. We're very fortunate here being able to talk about these issues, being informed by all these different perspectives. But we are, as Chris said, living in one of the most nature-depleted countries on the planet. My question, perhaps to Winnie or to Greta, is how do we engage with the 150 million people who are going to live in Ethiopia, the currently 55 million people who live in Kenya? How do we engage with those huge constituencies for whom wildlife is, to be frank, you don't actually have zoos in either country. There's, I mean, with a few exceptions, there are no zoos, but you have wildlife, but you have people who don't relate to that wildlife, and if they do, it's possibly because it's a pest or a threat, or their crops are at risk. How do we build a constituency? Because zoos seem to have failed to do that. 700 million visits to zoos around the world every year. You'd have thought there would be this army of people battering down the doors of our elected politicians calling for action. But that's not where it comes from. So how do we engage with your constituencies to bring about change in situ? Winnie?
Okay. So you shared some numbers when you started the conversation in terms of how many people visit zoos, how much the resources that are used to build and operate the 10,000 zoos around the world. And I believe that the idea at least from the zoos I've visited, is that they are doing this to save species. I think that's the idea. And the reason why people go to zoos is because zoos are the places where education, awareness, research is carried out. So a lot of people, I believe, go to zoos to get educated. And yet, from the numbers, it looks like the whole thing doesn't really work. Now, I come from a country that is in that part of the world that is considered the most mega diverse. For the simple reason, in my country, you can move from the mountains to the oceans, to the desert, to the savannas, you will find a whole range of species. And the statistics show that in the last 50 years, we've lost easily 1 million species. And the reason why we are losing species is known. We've got numerous reports. We know why we are losing species. It's land use changes, it is loss of habitats, it's all stuff that we understand. So we can actually do something about it. You ask the question, how are we going to ensure that the 55 million people in my country can coexist with wildlife? Now, we have something to work with. The wildlife is there. In my country, we have easily 40,000 elephants. We have lions and cheetah. The wildlife is there. The people, the governments in the government of Kenya has already put aside 12% of Kenya's land area as protected areas, were exclusively for the use of wildlife. The people have gone on and set up community conservancies that also support wildlife. Now, what is lacking is the resources to manage and maintain these places, to deal with human-wildlife conflict, to deal with land use planning, to deal with restoration, to deal with invasive species. So we know the problems, we know what we need to do to solve them. Some of them require resources, conversations, talking to governments, helping to make sure that the programs that are very well articulated on paper can actually be carried out. So my answer to this is that we know what the problem is. We know that what the solutions are. We need to just get to the table and work with governments, to work with people. If our interest is that my grandchildren and yours are able to see wildlife in the natural habitat where they deserve to be, then we have no choice. We have to do the work. And we have to do the work recognizing that Africa has people. And those people have aspirations. And so we also need to work with their aspirations. So I don't give up. I'm optimistic. I know today there is a woman who woke up and tried to get out of her house and she couldn't because there were lions just outside. She didn't kill them. She just went back to the house and waited for them to move away. So Africa has people that coexist with wildlife at very high cost. And yet, we think it's okay to take an elephant from Africa, put it in a 10 by 10 meter room during the winter, and have that elephant there bobbing its head up and down and spending millions of money telling people this elephant is happy, it gets pedicures and manicures and what. I'm not happy here, man. 5 degrees, I can't do 5 degrees for 3 days. So I think we know what we need to do. We just need to roll up our sleeves, go and do it. Put the money where our mouths are. Put the money where our hearts are. We need to stop this lie.
Greta, what would be your take on this? And I recognize that in terms of its wildlife estate and its wildlife tourism base, Kenya is actually quite advanced in that, and that Ethiopia, which has the most amazing wildlife, I've been fortunate enough to go into the Bali Mountains and see Ethiopian wolves for myself, but it's very, very small. So therefore, does wildlife get the priority that it deserves in a country like Ethiopia? And what can be done to connect the people with their own wildlife? Is there something you have in mind?
So I think I've made notes because there's so much to say. It's a very complex issue. And I think, first and foremost, recognizing that developing nations are not, they're called developing nations by the global north, but we are incredibly high biodiversity rich nations. And a lot of the areas where the culture of zoos and attending these caged establishments, if you look at the history, and obviously we all know, comes from a deeply dark history. And we can't change the narrative if we don't start telling the truth of what the root causes of the issue are. We can't look at wildlife in enclosures separate to the dysfunction that we have under the capitalist system. You know, as I mentioned briefly in my introduction, conversion of land for agriculture, fossil fuels that power these buildings, everything has a direct impact on the habitats of the wildlife that we care so much to protect. And there are people that live in those landscapes that are also being deeply impacted by the fact that their habitats that they depend on are also shifting overnight. My government in the last 2-3 years has faced armed conflict, climate drought, and now severe famine. So these are the things that governments are dealing with when we're coming to them discussing about human-wildlife coexistence. And I think it's really important to root ourselves that in the realism that we don't live in an ideal world. There are 10,000 zoos at the moment with live animals, but if all of them decided to shut down tomorrow, the places that we would rewild them to or take them to are incredibly unsafe, unprotected, and constantly at threat of being destroyed. That is the reality of what we're facing. And I mean, it doesn't take much. You just look out in London, it's a concrete jungle. There is no biodiversity. The nations in the global south, or the biodiverse rich nations, are aspiring to become London, you know, and that is the truth. And the more we destigmatize speaking about this, about our lifestyles and all this, I think the more we are able to all realize that whether you believe zoos should be open or that we should be focusing on rewilding, it brings us into a space of recognizing that the system is deeply dysfunctional and there's a lot of inequity. There's a lot of disparity on who's consuming and impacting the habitats, what lifestyles are being kind of championed as the norm. And when we have those uncomfortable conversations, we realize, oh God, it's going to take the entire planet being on the same side for us to reverse the impacts of climate change, for us to stop the biodiversity being destroyed, and for if, let's say, those 10,000 zoos were closed down, for those that we could rewild to actually have a chance and a shot at survival in the wild. Because, you know, when I think of like practical things, I think zoos do not ever tell the whole picture, and they do not tell it well. You know, I haven't been to a zoo in a very long time, but for the few times that I have been, especially in the global north, at these esteemed zoos, you know, I try and see if there's the nuances, you know, if you get to hear the stories of the people and the destruction and where it's coming from and the histories of dispossession and even the narrative that wild Africa didn't have people for centuries, for decades, that's what we were told. So I think as a start, zoos could be if any zoo decided to tell the real story, I think a lot of the visitors would have a completely different relationship to visiting a zoo. That's a start. And I think everyone's mentioned this, safeguarding the ecosystems that are currently intact should be a priority for everybody. And a lot of governments that I engage with, at least in Africa, they do want that, but they're put in a very difficult situation where they're managing humanitarian crises, severe inequality, and then having to engage in a global economy that only rewards you based on your GDP, on what you produce and how much you convert your land into money. So these are kind of the things that guide my discussions with regards to how we can build a world that really takes into considerations both people and nature.
So I'm going to come to Chris, and it comes off of what the three of you have said, really, but particularly, Greta, you said, or words to the effect of, that developed nations reward developing nations for becoming like themselves.
Absolutely.
And it would seem that if you look at developed nations, the common strand that runs right across pretty much all of them is a continuing diminution of nature. So we reward development, but development itself leads to an end to nature. Chris, you move in political circles, you talk to ministers, you talk to other broadcasters, you talk to politicians. Is there any sense that there is a nature-friendly strategy that could be developed that would not kind of reward destruction?
There is very much a sense that we need one of those. Is there a sense that it's immediately available? No. And the simple reason for that, if we look at politics, is that our political systems globally are based around short-termism, and the projects that we need to enact are not short-term. And so in those terms of office where people may make pledges, and we've had governments that have made pledges about recovering biodiversity, improving animal welfare standards, and so on and so forth, are frankly never going to be in a position where they can, roll those things out. These issues need to be apolitical, and that's why I believe that we as citizens need to take control of these. So we may elect representatives on other issues where short-term impacts can be profound and meaningful, but I think on these sorts of issues, then that's not the case. And it is underpinned by, essentially, consumption. We still live in a world where economists, rather than ecologists, are shaping our future, and that is enormously dangerous, because they continue to talk about consuming things, and that's the aspirations because of that capitalist system that we have. And that will destroy us all. In the UK at the moment, we use 2 planets worth of resources per capita. How is that feasible, given we've only got one planet? But we do it on the resource poverty of those nations in the global south. America uses 4 planets worth of resources. I mean, look, you don't need to open the Ladybird book of common sense to realize that that is going to fail. It is failing. It's failing on our watch, and we're watching it happen right now. So there are some fundamental changes that we need to make. But I think that in order to facilitate those, what we need, and what I try to interest politicians in, particularly in an election year, is low-hanging fruit. Mm-hmm. It's highly symbolic, easy wins, which will send clear signals to the electorate that they are aware of these issues, and that if there is the capacity at a given point, they may have some robust, resilient, and meaningful policies to address the more important, bigger issues. But going back to your original question, the 200-year experiment. The thing about experiments is that you set them up because you're looking for a result. And the result that was desired 200 years ago is not the result that we need or desire now. And it wasn't in the 1960s. When I was in that hell that was Southampton Zoo in 1964, I was in paradise. I was close to exotic animals, which otherwise I could not see. And that has been one of the, the whole mantras rolled out by the zoo world, that this will provide young people with formative experiences because they will be able to be in the proximity of animals that they will never see in their lifetime. Well, that was the 1960s. There are millions of young people at this point who are fixated by Taylor Swift, but they will never see her in the flesh. We have the capacity to engage. We have the capacity to engage young people, older people, and educate those people without the need for them to gawp at exhibits in enclosures. And that's why the zoo fraternity has failed. It's failed because it hasn't recognized that as time has moved on, it should be moving to a different result. The only people that seem to have woken up to that are Damian and my partner Charlotte. Charlotte is running a sanctuary. Damian has seen the light and is doing what zoos should be doing. But then again, we face a fundamental problem here, and that is that all of our intelligence, our creativity, imagination, so on and so forth, the human species is not terribly good at change. And the zoo world is amongst the worst at change. They don't see, they see change as a problem, not an opportunity. Mm-hmm. And to do that, to see it as an opportunity, you need the bravery of people like Damian and Charlotte. And there aren't enough of those people there. So we must make sure that we push for those changes, that we instigate those changes through lobbying, protesting, whatever it takes.
Thank you very much. So I had a little factoid here, which I thought was quite interesting about this sort of notion of zoo-based education. And this is just from a study in 2014, 2,800 children were observed. And 34%, so about a third, of the pupils who went on unguided tours of London Zoo, demonstrated some kind of positive learning experience. But I flip it always the other way around. That means that 66% of kids observed in this study either had no positive learning experience or, as the figures here suggest, 16% of them had negative learning experience. So they actually came away less informed, less advised, less educated by their experience of the zoo. And I did ask a colleague the other day in our education team what could be a negative learning experience. I was not awake at the time, because it's so obvious. If you see an animal in an alien environment and you think that that's where the animal lives, that's a negative learning experience. If you see animals from South America sharing enclosures with animals from Africa, that's a negative learning experience. This does not reflect the real world, the world that we live in and that we want to protect. What I'm feeling here is that there is I don't want to speak for you, but a fairly broad consensus that this experiment started with one reason, has not adapted, has not given us benefits, has, to use one word, failed. If that's the case, if people are not really being educated by going to the zoo, if species are not being conserved by zoos, if the research being carried out in zoos is more about keeping animals in zoos than it is about conserving the species as part of a dynamic, functional ecosystem, then my question is, what is the bridge between where we are now and where we want to get to? And specifically, I'm going to come straight back to Chris on this because of your direct experience, the role of sanctuaries, because I think it was Greta said, but if we shut the door and turn the key on 10,000 zoos, where will the animals go? I mean, we're always, Born Free is always being asked, where You just want to kill all the animals. Yeah, of course we do. Not. But sanctuaries have a transitional role to play, at least I think so. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're speaking there about education of the people that visit zoos. What about educating the zoos themselves? I mean, that's the thing that we need to do, because when the zoos are educated, or people that work within those institutions are educated, they change their minds and they do different things. And I can cite examples where there is a skill base within the zoo fraternity that has been turned to good. And I'll draw, on this occasion, away from Damian's endeavours. Edinburgh Zoo, Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, have this year reintroduced wildcats into the Cairngorm, and they have used expertise drawn, at least some of it, from the zoo fraternity. People know how to care for these animals, people understand their dietary requirements, so on, so the fundamentals of that, and they've successfully put these things back. We're working on another project with Bristol Zoo, where they're doing a similar thing for native crayfish here in the UK. Now, I'm not holding these up as paragons, nor of things that are significant in the grand scheme of things, but what I'm saying is that within that fraternity, and I'm sure Damian has exercised this as well, there will be people who have acquired skills which can be useful if they are re-educated in what we want from those skills. And what Charlotte's been trying to do at the Wild Heart Trust is turn a small zoo into a sanctuary. No breeding, so we take animals that have been harmed, principally big cats in European circuses, and we give them good end-of-life care. Now, the vast majority, and you'll know, need to be euthanized for physical or mental health difficulties that they have. But even then, Will, what is the point of having those animals in enclosures which we know are not suitable for them, right? In the grand scheme of things. There can only be one justifiable reason to keep them, and that has to be engagement and then education, so that we can protect their wild counterparts. And just like Damian, the mission of every sanctuary has to be to go out of business. It has to be, because we have to cut off the source of these tortured animals at that source. We've got to stop the circuses, we've got to stop the breeding, and eventually, when they live out their lives, that's it, they will not be replaced. And so we're in that transition where we could use these animals if the zoos could get a handle on education, not some pissy little sign with a map you can't read telling you what the animal eats that isn't worth 7 seconds of anyone's time because there's nothing there to learn anyway. I mean, for Christ's sake, we've got QR codes that can give you all sorts of information immediately. There are so many ways that modern technology, social media, all the way that young people engage with the world could be, immediately implemented within zoos, but they're still drawing those little things that I was looking at in the 1960s. It's pitiful.
Damian, I'm reflecting on what Chris has said. I mean, is education enough of a justification for there to be a zoo, or is it that education can transform the current situation away from keeping animals? I mean, we seem to think that there is no replacement for seeing the animal in the flesh. That's what we are told. And yet, you've just talked about Taylor Swift. I wouldn't know. But what I would say...
I've not seen her in the flesh. I mean, I can't vouch for how good an experience that is.
No, but what I would say is kids are absolutely fascinated by dinosaurs. And we'll sit up under the duvet with the torch, reading the thing when they've been told to go to sleep because they're fascinated by dinosaurs, and there are no dinosaurs. So it is not a straight line correlation that the only time you ever learn about something is because you see it. Can zoos, over a period of time, towards the twilight of their years, be re-energized, at least for that period of time, Damian, to deliver something of value, or is it too out of context?
So there's two questions. The education question,
yeah,
and then you've got the question of how do you phase out of zoos, and what's that process? And it's very difficult. But there's no empirical evidence at all that zoos educate positively. And our research shows that 0.01% of people that actually go to zoos leave actually becoming some type of activists or join Born Free. So there's no justification at all that you're educating people. In fact, you're actually educating the next generation. When you take children to zoos, you're educating the next generation that it's okay to keep animals in captivity for human entertainment. So what we've done over the last 40 years is culturalized every generation that it's okay to keep animals in captivity for human entertainment. So when those children grow up and have children, they're completely habituated. Oh, here's conservation. They don't bother researching it. There's education. I'm taking the kids to the zoo. But I can tell you, 99% of people who go to zoos, they're just going because it's a zoo. We're going to go to the fun fair. We're going to go to the zoo. They go to the zoo. They don't care. Right? That's all right. Not everyone has to care about the things we care about. But there's no education. It's the opposite. We're educating people that it's okay to keep animals in captivity, and it isn't. So that's got to change. The biggest problem is, how do you phase out of zoos? As I said, you have to get, let's say we all jump up with joy in 5 years. The government has announced that they're legislating, and zoos have to be phased out of over 20 years or 30 years. Will and I are on the phone. We're madly excited. Chris is on the phone. Victory. But think through that process. How is that going to actually work? Because, yes, if the public get wise and they stop going to zoos, zoos have less income, and zoos will be financially in trouble. And then if zoos have to slowly phase out of the animals that they keep because they die off, even the sanctuaries will die off. As you know, they're not breeding lions, their lions have died. They're not going to replace the lions unless they can rescue them. So you now will have a crisis of zoos in this country, or Europe, but let's talk about this country, who will all go bust. Every single one will go bust. So we're not going to euthanize the animal. So it's difficult. How do we sort this out? Now, my view is that you can only find a solution to this problem with government money, because there's no other way to do it. Because the zoos will go bust and the animals will end up being euthanized. So you can't rewild 98% of the animals in zoos. As I said, they're hybridized, they're diseased. It's impossible, even if you can find the places to rewild, which is very, very difficult. So that journey of our dream of ending zoos, of having no animal in captivity, is at the moment is just a dream. Because until we learn how to make that pathway, how do we make that journey where you can actually phase out of zoos, but that is going to cause financial calamity for the people who have these animals, even the sanctuaries that have these animals. Who's going to pay for that? The public will stop coming, rightly so. The animals will start dying off. The cages will be empty. So no one's answered that question. And that has to be a question that has to be answered, even before you get to beyond zoos. Beyond zoos is a world with no animals in captivity. But how do we get there? And I don't see any other way without government money, because no zoo will do it because you're committing financial suicide.
Yeah, it is a big challenge. I'm going to come to Chris because Chris has got a point, but I want to just ask Winnie. Winnie, in Kenya, you've been there, I've been there, the animal orphanage in Nairobi. Every day, every school day, I don't know how many, thousands and thousands of kids. There's a tiny little, I don't know, what is it, 6 acres, about that, 6 or 7 acres. Just thousands and thousands of kids are charging through it. They do the 7-second thing. They screech to a halt in front of the whatever it is, and then they scoot off and go to the next enclosure and the rest of it. It wasn't like that in the 1960s. Showing my age, it wasn't like that in the 1960s, but it is a money maker. It makes quite a lot of money for government. And so the government is caught in it's a bit like here in the UK, if you've got a really rotten zoo, it's licensed by the local authority. If the local authority is faced with evidence that says it should be closed down, they've got quite a difficult decision to make. Because that zoo probably brings tens, hundreds of thousands of people to their local area who eat in the pub, they go to the restaurant, they shop in the shops, they may stay in the local bed and breakfast or whatever. So they're balancing the kind of what should we really do the right thing against the economic drivers that would be a disincentive to take really tough action. I'm not happy with the orphanage. I don't know if you've been there recently, but when it's making a lot of money, it's hard to change people's minds.
I think a number of things come up for me from the discussion that has just gone. One is that the most important motivation for zoos and captive facilities to keep going is a commercial motivation. I think we confuse these things by thinking of zoos as conservation areas. These are basically businesses that are creating shareholder value. And so the decision, for instance, to bring an elephant in is not based on that they've done great research about how an elephant can live out a great life in the zoo. Is they've seen the numbers that the neighboring zoo, since they brought elephants, have got a lot more people coming through the revolving door. So the whole idea of how zoos and captive facilities are structured are that they are a business. And they've got very good marketing departments. I bet you that most zoos have better resource marketing departments than they have vets or science departments. I'm almost certain that their marketing budget is probably bigger than any research or education budget they could probably have. So it's also important for us to think about the capitalism that shapes the whole narrative around zoos. Why am I talking about this? It's because when we talk about beyond zoos, we first have to understand the motive of keeping animals or keeping exhibits or even the discussion on circuses. It's really a commercial motive. And so the only way you end that is by making sure that nobody's coming through the door to pay that money. Because the moment shareholder value is not being created, then zoos have no motivation for staying. Now, the question about what will happen to the animals is another question, completely. It's another problem. And that brings me to the animal orphanage in Nairobi. You're completely right. It started as a place to bring in injured animals that were supposed to then be released back to Nairobi National Park. But slowly, as people started coming through to see these animals, a lot of them are kids from neighboring underprivileged schools that cannot afford to go into the national parks to see the animals that are roaming free. And so the orphanage creates a very convenient and affordable way for them to be shown this wildlife in a less than ideal situation. But the motive is purely money-making. It's purely commercial. And so we need to separate this from conservation, education, and research to recognize that we've lost the plot straight away. Because the moment we are using animals to just generate money, our morality is, first of all, completely warped. So we have a moral question there that we need to answer. Whether the zoo is in Kenya or it is in London, there is a moral question there, which has to do with what are we willing to do to make the next buck? What are we willing to do? Are we willing, just 50 years ago, were willing to put human beings behind cages to make money. Yeah. We were willing to display human beings in circuses to make money. So the motivation, the profit motivation needs to be thought through. And it should not cloud our decisions, because the moment we have a moral question, we need to deal with it as a moral question.
Thank you very much. Winnie. So I'm keeping my eye on the clock because I don't want us to run out of time and not have any Q&A. But I'm going to do this. I'm going to come to Chris, who wanted to make a point, and then I'm going to come to Greta. And Greta, I'm going to ask you first, this is giving you time now to quickly think, what would be, there is never a silver bullet, but if there was one activity, one action that you felt would deliver on the stated objectives, that is better conservation, better education, better, more applied research, to reverse, to slow, halt, and reverse the decline in biodiversity. And if it's not zoos, what is it? And then I will ask everyone the same, but I'm going to ask you to be brief because I have to say something to summarize everything, and then I have to open it up. Also, I have to open it up for the question and answer. So Chris, you had a particular thought.
To be honest, when you really hit the nail on the head that I was going to make, and that is that certainly here in the UK, you know, zoos make their money through footfall through the door. The marketing departments are all about getting those people in, and part of that marketing is that they continue to breed animals. They want cubs, if you like. They want something cute and cuddly. They want pandas, or whatever happens, so they can sell their fluffy toys, even though it's economic madness in that particular case to have gone down that route in Edinburgh. But the key thing is that drives and it perpetuates this. So without Damian's public money coming in, then that situation is going to persist because they have no choice. They'll go bust if that doesn't happen. But let's just take a look at this country when it comes to how we spend public money. We give money to the football premiership, one of the most economically bloated, morally bankrupt, things that we could possibly do. We give money to the Premiership. We support a sheep farming industry, which is all but unprofitable. And we give money to national parks, where we don't get public good for that public money. Why shouldn't we? If zoos put together a program of transformation, of transition, why shouldn't we support them with public money to help them through that? We do it in so many other ways, and we fail the public by spending that money incorrectly. But if they were doing things properly, then I think that's a perfectly valid thing to do. And as Damian says, probably the only answer.
Very interesting. How our government of whatever complexion spends our money, that's a whole new discussion. So Greta, your 60 seconds on what, 60 seconds everybody, what is that action that could transform the future for this discussion?
So I think, first and foremost, I believe we need to discern between the fact that there's a lot of people that work at zoos that are trying to do the right thing. There are scientists, there are people that are working tirelessly to research, to understand, these are biobanks, and it's not just animals that are saved by zoos. There's botanical gardens, fungi, plants, trees, species. And in Ethiopia, the Ethiopian wolf would have never been saved from extinction if it wasn't for Frankfurt Zoological Society stepping in back in the 90s. And Born Free has been a huge partner with them as well. So I think if I had to think of one thing, I think it's that we need to stop arguing amongst ourselves as environmentalists about the nitty-gritty, because it's wasting time. There's way bigger fish to fry. And if we all came together, understand that the human condition, we will never agree on everything. But we are all on the right side of the coin, which is we care about the environment, we care about biodiversity, and we want to do what's right for the planet and for people. And therefore, we need to come together and find common ground, things we do agree on, and then use that to challenge the bigger stakeholders that are driving the destruction. Zoos, at the end of the day, yes, they are funneling a lot of money into something that is completely useless. But if we come together with less aggressive disagreements, I think we have a much stronger narrative if we work together to find and build a world that both humans and wildlife can coexist.
Thank you very much. Damian, and it's like Mastermind, and your 60 seconds start now.
So here's the problem. Let's wave a magic wand, there's no zoos. The question is, how do we protect our ecosystems around the world? And you look at billions of pounds have been put into this by well-meaning NGOs, by governments, and we've actually failed. We know what's happened to the world, we know what's happened to the forests, we know what's happened to our marine life, we know what's happened to our rivers, we know all of it. So we're very knowledgeable now about the problems. We put billions of pounds into this, and we're failing. So the question we need to ask ourselves, why are we failing? And that's not happening. And when I look at why are we failing, it's on the ground floor of conservation. And what I mean by that is the reason why things are not happening on the ground floor the way we all expect them to, the way we all expect with billions of pounds going into this, is, I'm afraid, corruption. Governments across the world are corrupt, and the reason why they're corrupt is wildlife is big business. Illegal wildlife trade is, I think, the third biggest illegal business in the world after drugs and arms. So you have well-meaning NGOs throwing money at the problem, but it's not having much effect because of corruption. So let's not throw billions of pounds at this. Let's throw billions of pounds at ending corruption in these countries all around the world. If you end corruption, you can fix the problem. If you don't fix corruption, you cannot fix the problem, and we're just throwing good money after bad.
Winnie.
I don't know what to say. Okay, so as an African person who every day grapples with the problems of keeping intact ecosystems, biological systems that are healthy, that are doing what nature requires nature to do, I want to believe that because we know that we cannot do nature's work, we absolutely must work to ensure that ecosystems survive, that biodiversity survives. I work every day thinking about research questions, bringing researchers to look at fundamental questions about how ecosystems work. I spend a lot of time trying to find resources for the researchers to ask those fundamental questions. Why do I do that? It's because I believe that we cannot fight nature. We cannot create that world that's going to give us medicine, that's going to give us clean air, that is going to give us the gifts that nature gives us. We cannot create it any other way. And so those places that hold the promise, those spaces where we can have wildlife doing what wildlife is supposed to do, where we can have elephants roaming free and expressing themselves in their totality, those places need to be seen as precious. And we need to put our brains together, our resources. We need to face the challenges that make it difficult for those places to exist. If it is corruption, let's face it. If it's politics, let's face it. If we need to put money into research, let's do it. Let's not look at it as a big elephant in the room where everybody's touching bits and thinking they are solving the problem. I think, as Greta says, let's be brave and courageous and be driven by the knowledge that what we are losing, those 1 million species, those ecosystems that we are losing are so crucial for our survival. It's our lives on the line. We need to either find another planet You know, if we give up, we just need to go and find another planet, and I don't know where it is. So, I mean, look, guys, if we don't face up to the fact that we cannot live in this world without the Amazon forest, we cannot live in this world without the Congo forest, we cannot live without lungs in this world, we are destroying ourselves. And so, whatever complexity we need to face, let's be brave and courageous because our lives depend on it.
What should the zoo do? The zoo has got to wake up and smell the lentils. It's got to look in the mirror and realise that it's failed, alongside all of those other collective failures that we've made to preserve the world when we've known better how to do that. It's failed in terms of its field conservation, it's failed in terms of its reintroductions of any meaningful scale, it's failed in terms of its education, and yet we have solutions to all of these things. It's just got to accept that, and accept that change is not a choice any longer. If we don't change, we die. It's that simple. And they could be a valuable part of the solution. David Barkley and his team that have put those wildcats back, they're part of a solution in that way. But they need to look at the bigger picture. You cannot run a zoo where you invite people in to look at exhibits on a day which is fun for all the family. It's not fun standing and looking at a caged animal. That isn't fun. It's not fun for that caged animal, and it shouldn't be framed as such. They've got to look at their language when they talk about collections, when they talk about exhibits. They've got to think of bigger picture stuff when it comes to the fact that people come to gawp at exotic animals, but then they go in the bloody cafe and eat farm animals. How does that work? They are way out of time. They are not thinking critically about this point in time and everything they've learned. And they're not even looking and recognizing their own strengths, with few exceptions. It's that simple. When you admit, as Damian has done, as Charlotte admits that her father did, that what you were doing was wrong, it's so empowering. It's so uplifting. It can be euphoric. You feel that, yes, I've empowered myself to accept change. So at this point, they should summon all of the ingenuity, all of the imagination, all of the creativity that they collectively got with their large pots of money and change.
Right. I am looking at a huge clock here. And that was a fascinating summary of people's perspectives. We do have some roving microphones. There's one, and there's one. And I'm going to take some questions. It won't be as long as I'd hoped, and I will then speak very quickly at the end to try and bring some strands together, but like in 60 seconds. So I see 1, 2, 3 questions. No, look, there's loads and loads of questions. Let's try the lady putting, I was going to say putting 2 fingers up, but the lady there, yes, with the glasses on, that's you, madam, yeah. Sorry, I feel like Fiona Bruce suddenly.
Hi, I think you'll probably call me the elephant in the room. I'm a habitat designer for zoos. Worked in Chinese zoos for 20 years, and it's been my honor. I'd just like to say that the new trend in zoo design is the unzoo, and we'd like to put animals in the habitat and people looking at the animals in the habitats. My conflict has been, as you've all said, about the wild and how safe it is in the wild. And in Botswana, they said that 200 elephants lifted for the hunting ban, so that was quite stressful. in terms of animals in the wild, and then 300 elephants died from the cyanobacteria and the drought. So I find that the wild is not completely safe. But what I'd love to say is I think we can embrace the expertise of this fantastic panel, which has really, really enjoyed tonight, and maybe work with zoos because they have fantastic conservationists which would like to work with you. So I hear what everybody's saying about zoos, but let's all join together in helping conservation in the world. That's what we'd like to do. Thank you very much.
I'm going to treat that not as a question, it's a comment. I'm going to just treat that as a comment rather than a question, but it's a very nice comment to have. And I'm going to go to this young man here, who I know, by the way. I'm declaring, I know Hector.
Yeah, hi, I'm Hector. I'm the youth ambassador for Born Free. So I recently sat a GCSE where the topic of zoos was very positive, there were no negatives mentioned, and it was all very pro-zoos. And I was wondering if there was any way where formal education and GCSE content can become more balanced and far less biased.
Yeah. I could just sort of mention that a friend of mine studied biology for A-level a long time ago, and she elected for violence-free science. So she said, I will not do frog dissection, I will not do the rat dissection, I will only do plant-based studies, modules. And if it doesn't exist, if there isn't a module that you can use that is not based around the applause of animals being kept in zoos, then there should be. And maybe we should talk to our National Educators Department of Education to offer people the choice, a bit more of a choice, a bit more of a balanced view. I would suggest, if I'm looking at the panel to see if anybody disagrees with that, but more choice will mean more informed people. I'm going to take one or two more questions, and I'm trying to be very balanced. I would love to go to Dominic, I'd love to go to James, but I feel that I shouldn't just pick the people that I know. Seriously. There's a lady frantically waving in yellow at the back. So, yeah, if you could just reach out to her. Here we go.
Hello, yes. I'd like to carry on from the young man, actually. I work for Animal Aid, so I am an educator. I teach in schools. I teach veganism in schools, sustainability in schools. And one of the first things I say to the students is you don't go to zoos, you go to sanctuaries if you must go to see the animals. So I don't know if you work with Animal Aid, but I do think there's a connection there that should be made. There's not enough of us in schools doing this, and there's not enough schools wanting us to go in either. But yes, it is about education, and it is about veganism. I do feel that all of this is about veganism, because we need to stop animal agriculture. It's destroying our planet. And it's also the mentality of people that believe that they can exploit animals for food or for entertainment or anything. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to make one...
Greta.
Yes, I just want to make one point about the education. I think sometimes, in the world that we live today, with social media, there's so much information out there. You don't need to kind of have a tunnel vision at what you're being taught. And it's amazing because you can listen to those that live closest to the wild species that you want to protect. And it's no coincidence that, indigenous communities, local communities in the global south have tenure over 25 to 35% of land. And within that space, 80% of it is biodiverse. And that is not a coincidence. So shifting your perspective and learning from those that have long safeguarded wild species and natural intact ecosystems will be the greatest teachers there are for you. And listening to them and funneling money directly to them, because that is the problem of the system at the moment. If you're not a formal institution, there's nowhere to give money. But that's what the formal institutions want you to believe. You can help communities directly, and they're not protecting or safeguarding the environment for the global north. They're doing it because their very livelihoods depend on it. Yeah.
Thank you. Ooh. There's a lady there, and that's, I'm afraid, going to be the last question. But oh, the lady in pink. No. I sort of feel like Krista Berg now. The lady there, and then we're going to, and Rod, I don't think I can, yes.
Hi there. Can I ask if you think there is enough regulation between what we call a sanctuary and what we call a zoo in the UK? Because I have worked both for a sanctuary in the UK and I've worked for Port Lympne and Howletts, and for me, there's not too much distinction between where I've worked. They have similar views. One, I find some people only go to a sanctuary, but there's not much difference between where I've worked there and personally between Port Lympne and Howletts.
That's a good comment, and with the panel's indulgence, I'll pick up on that in my now 8-second closing remarks. The lady in pink. Oh.
My courage has left me.
Oh no, go on. Be brave. Come on.
Thank you so much. This has been so informative, and I think I can speak for a lot of people here. We are the least virtual reality people. That's why we're here. So what about holographic zoos? Is that an issue that's going around? Is that something that's being talked about?
Yeah.
I've heard it's a big success in LA and various other places. But
I can't take any more. Rod, I'm so sorry.
It's a quickie. I don't need the mic.
Okay, what?
We are, it's just to everybody here, the panel, the audience, we are the converted. How do you use the media, the press, the broadcast media, and social media to get our message through?
Thank you, Rod. It's super important. Right. I'm going to turn to page 207 in my booklet here, and I had a lot of concluding remarks, and I'm not really going to be able to say any of them because I want to try and use what little time there is to draw the strands together from what I think has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. So my first thing is could you please put your hands together for our fantastic panel? I'm going to just say two things then, and I hope I get some of this right. It seems to me, listening to what you've all said this evening, that what we are faced with is both a practical and a moral dilemma. There is a great moral component to the notion that we find it acceptable to lock up other fellow travelers on this planet for our own entertainment. And not that long ago, as was mentioned, we used to do it to people as well. There was the guy in the Bronx Zoo who was put on display as a pygmy. That was how he was described. Eventually, he was given his liberty and he shot himself. There was the Carl Hagenbeck, who used to put Inuit people, Eskimo people on display along with animals. And you think that's a long time ago. Those were both 100 or more than 100 years ago. But I was in Thailand at Sriracha Tiger Kingdom in 2004, and there was a person of color in a tiger-striped loincloth from Africa with a tiger on display in a goldfish bowl type environment. I mean, you know, we are not that far away from our basest instincts. Questions that have come up this evening, or points that occur to me, is this whole education line that is presented by zoos. Americans have a term for it. It's called edutainment. It's not really education, really. It's the lightest touch of education, which somehow makes you feel slightly better for doing it. I took the kids to the zoo today. You know, it's informative stuff. But I talked to a journalist, he's here this evening, I won't mention who it was, and he said, I go to the zoo quite often, I take my kids, and when we see a certain species, I tell them about, you know, what's going on with that species, what's happening in the species habitat, and I said, then they're the luckiest kids, because they're not getting that from the zoo, they're getting that from you. You are the teacher. The zoo is just providing the blank canvas. What else did I have down? Oh, hang on, it was on this page. We've got to take the politics out of this. This point's been made several times. This isn't about the agenda of one particular political persuasion or another political persuasion. The protection of our planet, the restoration of nature, the conservation of the ecosystem services that we all rely on should not be political. It should be universally accepted by every single elected leader that we have. And with that should come the resources to make sure that we invest in nature rather than continually seeing it as the free bank that we go to. What do we have this thing? Someone will know this. Earth Overreach Day? Is that what it's called? Earth Overreach Day? Yeah? Yeah, Overshoot Day. That means that at the start of the year, you calculate just how many natural resources the Earth has available and can generate, like interest on a bank account. And at some point in the year, you've used up all the interest, and you're now eating into the capital. That day is getting earlier and earlier. It's now July, it'll soon be June. We will eventually be living off of the capital of the planet, not off the interest that it can generate. And then I did want to pick up on this point about zoos going bust. These things don't happen overnight, that is for sure. But we have no dolphins in captivity in this country. We have no dolphins in captivity. We have no dolphin area. And that came about through a combination of three things. The first was the government of the day introduced higher standards, and those higher standards came at a price, and no dolphin area was willing to pay the money to upgrade. It came about because the public, in their droves, started to say no. I'm not going to go. I'm not going to pay the ticket. And the same applied to wild animals in circuses. They withered and died on the vine because people just simply weren't prepared to pay to go. And it also came about, the dolphin area one, because organizations were willing to step up and say, we'll take those dolphins and we'll give them a second, as Damian is doing, by rewilding those animals, giving them the chance of life in the wild again. And we were fortunate enough to be part of that. The final point I was going to make was that it goes to the point made by the lady from Animal Aid, who said, why don't we get together? And actually to the lady here from the zoo design, immersive zoo design world, you know, habitat, I'm not sure I can use the word habitats, but anyway, enclosures and people looking in. Here we are. We may be as few, but we are deeply committed and interested individuals who want to see this change. Maybe one of the things that comes out of this is some kind of forum that allows organizations that we would naturally align with, but perhaps organizations that we wouldn't naturally align with, to come together to say, what could change look like? And there would be a lot of bartering that would go on in that to try and determine what success looks like. But the one thing I guess I've learned in 40 years of doing this is you have to imagine success. You have to imagine what success will be like. If you are only interested in better management, laws that make it a little bit better, laws that say you can't keep elephants unless you give them 5 acres. 5 acres? Are you serious? that you have to have elephant enclosures that are bigger than your car park. That's not success. So imagine what success could be like. Fill in the survey. Ooh, look at that. That's probably been on for ages. Look, give us your feedback. Give us your views. They really matter. And I'm not going to lose contact with these guys. This isn't a panel of people that have sort of just come together for the evening. This is a panel of people who are deeply committed to change. Change at every single level. And just maybe we can bring about that change if, as we've been told tonight, we are brave. Let's be brave. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you. And you're going already. And I was going to say, I was going to say, because it's me, and because it's Born Free, and because of that, I was just going to say that. And my dad is no longer around, and my mum is 92 and is at home, has been watching. And I want to... I just wanted to dedicate this evening to them, because this is, for me, is a bit of a dream come true. Thank you very much.